The Allison engine thrums through your bones, a familiar heartbeat in the thin, cold air over Assam. Below, the jungle is a green carpet, deceptively peaceful. It's just another patrol. But then you see them. Not one, not 10, but a sky filled with enemy aircraft. 64 of them. The radio is silent. You are utterly alone. Your P-40 Warhawk feels small, a single tooth against a buzzsaw. Your mission: protect the airfield at all costs. Your reality: survival is now measured in seconds. What do you do when the odds aren't just long, they're impossible? In the grand tapestry of the Second World War, some threads are woven in brilliant color, chronicling the great battles of Europe and the Pacific. But other threads, equally vital, are found in the forgotten corners of the conflict. The China-Burma-India Theater, or CBI, was one such place. It was a brutal, unforgiving front, a war fought not only against a determined enemy, but against monsoon rains, impassable mountains, and crippling disease. Here, the primary Allied strategy hinged on a lifeline of breathtaking audacity. An aerial supply route over the eastern Himalayas, a treacherous passage known to its pilots simply as the Hump. Unarmed C-47 Skytrain transports loaded with fuel, ammunition, and medicine flew from airfields in India to support the Chinese war effort against Japan. Every flight was a gamble against the highest mountains on Earth. The key to this entire operation was a string of airfields hacked out of the Indian jungle. Among the most vital was Din John. It was more than just a runway. It was a beating heart, pumping the lifeblood of war into China. To lose it would be catastrophic. On the morning of December the 13th, 1943, Second Lieutenant Philip Adair of the 89th Fighter Squadron was not thinking of grand strategy. He was a pilot, and his world was the cockpit of his Curtiss P-40N Warhawk. The P-40 was a veteran of the war's early days, a rugged and heavily armed fighter that could absorb tremendous punishment. It was a dependable beast, but by late 1943, it was a step behind the newer, more agile fighters it faced. Adair's mission that day was the definition of routine, a standard combat air patrol scanning the empty skies for any sign of trouble. Below him, the dense green of the Assam jungle stretched to the horizon, a primordial landscape that had swallowed men and machines without a trace. The air was thin, the sun was bright, and the deep, throaty roar of his Allison V-1710 engine was the only sound in his solitary world. For a pilot, boredom was a luxury, a sign that for one more day he was safe. But that luxury was about to evaporate. It started as it always did, with tiny specks, dark against the brilliant blue sky. A pilot's eyes, trained to see things others would miss, are his most important weapon. Adair watched them, his hand instinctively tightening on the control stick. They were not Allied planes. The specks grew, multiplying as they drew closer, resolving from a vague smudge into an undeniable, terrifying reality. This was no scouting party. This was an armada. He began to count, his mind struggling to process the scale of the formation. First, the bombers. 24 Mitsubishi Ki-21 heavy bombers, nicknamed Sally by the Allies. They flew in a precise, disciplined V formation, a spearhead aimed directly at the heart of the Hump operation. And then he saw the Hornets guarding the nest. Swarming above and around the bombers was a screen of escort fighters. The nimble Nakajima Ki-43, the Oscar. He counted 40 of them. The final tally was chilling. 24 bombers, 40 fighters, 64 enemy aircraft. The radio was silent. The sky, moments before empty and peaceful, was now filled with the gravest threat the CBI had ever seen. And standing between that threat and the complete annihilation of Din John Airfield was a single American pilot in an aging P-40 Warhawk. The choice he made in the next few seconds would not only determine his own fate, but could alter the course of the war in Asia. For a man alone in a metal tube miles above the Earth, facing a force of 64 enemy aircraft, the first instinct is survival. The human brain screams to turn, to dive, to run. Every fiber of his being would be urging him to flee the certain death that lay ahead. But Second Lieutenant Philip Adair was not just a man. He was a pilot, a hunter, and a guardian. In that critical moment, training, discipline, and a cold, hard logic took over. He understood the situation with terrifying clarity. Running was not an option. The bomber formation was a dagger pointed at the throat of the Allied war effort in Asia. If he fled, Din John Airfield, with its precious C-47 transports, its stockpiles of fuel, and its hundreds of personnel, would be wiped from the map. He was the only thing in the way. The mission was not to survive. The mission was to stop them. His mind raced, dissecting the aerial geometry of the battle. Engaging the 40 Oscar fighters was a fool's errand. They were lighter, more maneuverable, and designed for dogfighting. They would swarm him, chew his P-40 to pieces, and he would accomplish nothing. A traditional fight was suicide. He had to change the rules of the game. His target, he realized, had to be the bombers. The 24 Sallies were the real threat. They were the payload. The fighters were merely the shell protecting it. If he could crack that shell, if he could disrupt the bombers themselves, he might force them to abandon their run. Bombers of that era relied on flying in tight, disciplined formations. It allowed them to concentrate their defensive fire against attackers, and more importantly, to drop their bombs in a concentrated pattern for maximum destruction. A scattered formation was an ineffective one. Chaos was his only weapon. His plan formed in a matter of seconds, born of sheer desperation and tactical genius. He would not dogfight, he would become a thunderbolt. The P-40 Warhawk, while not as agile as an Oscar, had its own brutal strengths. It was heavy, rugged, and it could dive like a stone. Adair would use this to his advantage. His strategy would be a series of high-speed, head-on diving attacks directly through the bomber formation. By flying straight at them, he would present the smallest possible target for the briefest amount of time. The combined closing speed of his P-40 and the oncoming bombers would be over 600 miles per hour, giving their gunners a mere heartbeat to draw a bead on him. It was a terrifying gamble. He would be flying into a wall of lead from the bombers' nose-mounted guns, but it was the only way to maximize shock and sow confusion among the enemy pilots. He pushed the throttle to the firewall, the Allison engine roaring in protest as he climbed for altitude. Every foot of height was potential energy, fuel for the devastating dives he was about to make. He needed to be above them, to be the hawk striking from the sun. He armed his 6 50 caliber machine guns, the heavy thump-thump of the charging handles, a final, percussive confirmation of his intent. Below, the Japanese armada flew on, oblivious to the lone hunter circling above them, a single cloud with teeth of steel. From his vantage point, Adair lined up his first pass. He picked his aiming point, the lead bomber of the entire formation. If he could take out the leader, the rest might fall into disarray. He took a deep breath, his knuckles white on the stick. The time for thinking was over. he pushed the P-40's nose over into a steep, screaming dive. The green jungle canopy rushed up to meet him as he plummeted toward the enemy, a one-man cavalry charge in the vast, empty sky. The odds were impossible, but the attack had begun. The P-40 screamed downwards, trading altitude for speed in a savage conversion of potential to kinetic energy. The wind howled past the canopy, the airframe vibrating under the immense strain. For Philip Adair, the world narrowed to a single point of focus, the cockpit of the lead Mitsubishi Ki-21 bomber. It grew in his gun sight with astonishing speed. The sky was no longer a vast, open space. It was a rapidly shrinking corridor filled with enemy aircraft. He saw the frantic flashes from the bomber's nose turret, the green tracers reaching out for him like phantom fingers, but at a closing speed of hundreds of miles per hour, they seemed to drift by in slow motion. He held his nerve, finger resting on the firing button, waiting for the perfect, fleeting moment. Then he pressed it. The P-40 shuddered as 6 .50 caliber machine guns erupted in a deafening roar, a torrent of heavy slugs tearing across the small gap of air. He saw his rounds strike home, a series of brilliant flashes, stitching a line across the bomber's port engine and wing route. He didn't wait to see the result. His focus was already on the next, most dangerous part of the maneuver, surviving the pass. He yanked back on the stick, his body crushed into his seat by the brutal G-forces, and sliced through the Japanese formation. For a dizzying second, he was inside the hornet's nest. Enemy aircraft were everywhere, above, below, and on both sides. The air was thick with wings and fuselages. A collision seemed inevitable. He caught a fleeting glimpse of the shocked faces of enemy gunners as he flashed past their windows, a phantom that was there and then gone. He broke through the other side, the sky ahead of him suddenly, blessedly empty. He glanced back. The lead bomber he had targeted was faltering. Trailing a thick plume of black smoke, it peeled away from the formation, its bombing run ruined. The perfect V of the Japanese spearhead was now broken. The first crack had appeared in their discipline. His attack had achieved its primary goal, chaos, but it had also stirred the nest. The 40 Oscar fighters, initially tasked with flying top cover, were no longer passive observers. They had been stunned by the sheer audacity of a single fighter charging headlong into their bombers. Now their shock turned to rage. Like angry wasps, several of them broke formation and began to dive after him. Adair knew he couldn't afford to get entangled. He used the immense speed from his dive to execute a zoom climb, converting his kinetic energy back into altitude, clawing his way back up into the sun's glare. The lighter, more nimble Oscars struggled to follow his energy-driven maneuver. He was once again above them, repositioning for another strike. The Japanese bomber pilots, their leader gone and their formation compromised, began to waver. Their tight-knit group started to loosen, the pilots visibly unnerved by the ferocious, seemingly suicidal attacks from an enemy who should have run. Adair didn't give them a moment to recover. He rolled his Warhawk over and plunged down again, this time from a different angle, a different vector. He was a sheepdog harrying a vast flock, refusing to let them settle. His target was another bomber on the edge of the now disintegrating formation. Once again, he screamed in, guns blazing. He saw his tracers rip into the fuselage and tail of the Sally. He didn't need to destroy them all. He just needed to convince them that pressing the attack was impossible, that the air over Din John was a death trap. He broke off, the Oscars again in hot pursuit, their guns chattering uselessly behind him. He had hit them twice, broken their cohesion, and single-handedly disrupted a major bombing raid. He had their full attention. And now, The 40 angry fighter pilots were closing in, determined to exact their revenge. The battle had just entered its second, far more personal and far more dangerous phase. The sky over Assam had transformed from an empty arena into a swirling vortex of aerial combat. But this was no duel. It was a maelstrom. Philip Adair's P-40 was the eye of the storm. His high-speed passes had succeeded beyond his wildest hopes. The bomber formation was completely shattered. Pilots, unnerved by the ferocity of his attacks, had broken formation, some already turning back towards Burma, their payloads of bombs still secure in their bays. They had come to destroy Din John Airfield, but they hadn't even reached it. Strategically, Adair had already won. The mission was a success. Now, a new mission began, one dictated not by orders, but by the primal instinct for survival. He had enraged the hornet's nest, and the hornets were coming for him. The Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars were superb dogfighters. In a turning fight, the heavier P-40 was at a significant disadvantage. Adair knew this. His only hope was to use the Warhawk's superior diving speed and rugged construction to his advantage. He was no longer on the offensive. Every maneuver, every turn and roll was now a desperate calculation to keep the swarm of enemy fighters from landing a fatal blow. He dived and climbed, using energy tactics to keep the Oscars at bay, forcing them into vertical fights where their lighter airframes bled speed. But there were simply too many of them. For every one he shook off his tail, two more would take its place, their guns spitting fire. It was a battle of attrition, and he was the sole participant on his side. Then it happened. A sharp, violent jolt like a giant steel fist slammed into his aircraft. The cockpit filled with the acrid smell of cordite and hot metal. A burst of enemy fire had found its mark. Warning lights on his instrument panel flashed a sudden, terrifying crimson. The deep, reassuring roar of the Allison engine behind him changed its tune, sputtering into a ragged, choking cough. His oil pressure gauge plummeted to 0. A quick glance over his shoulder confirmed his worst fears. Thick, greasy black smoke was pouring from the engine cowling, a death shroud trailing behind him. The heart of his Warhawk had been fatally wounded. The temperature needle for the engine coolant climbed rapidly, burying itself in the red. The Allison was overheating, tearing itself apart from the inside out. He was now flying a dead machine. It just didn't know it yet. As if that wasn't enough, another devastating impact rocked the P-40. This time, the controls in his hands went slack, then horribly stiff. He tried to bank, to maneuver away from the relentless attackers, but the stick felt disconnected, useless. He pushed the rudder pedals, but the plane responded sluggishly, like a wounded animal. A well-aimed burst had sliced through the guts of his plane, severing the control cables to his ailerons and elevators. He had lost his ability to control the aircraft's pitch and roll in any conventional sense. He was no longer a pilot flying a plane. He was a passenger in a 7-ton metal coffin that was beginning to fall out of the sky. The nose of the P-40, no longer held up by functioning elevators, began to drop into a terminal dive. The enemy fighters, seeing him smoking and crippled, swarmed in for the kill. For Philip Adair, the battle was over. The fight for his life had just begun. The P-40 was dying, and it was dragging him with it into the green abyss of the jungle below. With no elevator control, every law of aerodynamics was forcing the nose of the aircraft down into an ever-steepening, non-recoverable dive. Bailing out was the only sane option. The Japanese fighters were still buzzing around him, eager to witness the final, fiery conclusion of their victory. But something in Philip Adair refused to surrender his aircraft to the jungle or his life to the silk canopy of a parachute. He was a pilot, and a pilot flies his plane until the last possible moment. In the crucible of those few seconds, with the ground rushing up and his controls useless, his mind worked with a desperate, incandescent clarity. He was not thinking about textbooks or flight manuals. No manual had ever been written for a situation like this. He was thinking about the raw physics of flight. He still had his rudder, which gave him a crude ability to yaw the plane left and right, and crucially, his engine, though mortally wounded, was still producing a final surge of power. He reasoned that if he couldn't pull the nose up, perhaps he could use the torque and momentum of the aircraft itself. What followed was a moment of pure, unadulterated improvisation, an act of aerial intuition that bordered on genius. He kicked the rudder hard. The P-40, already in a dive, responded by skidding sideways. He then used the last vestiges of his aileron trim to help nudge the plane into a roll. Slowly, protestingly, the heavy fighter began to rotate around its longitudinal axis. The green jungle canopy swung up and over his head, replaced by the blue of the sky. He was now flying upside down. For a moment, the maneuver seemed to have only worsened his plight. But then, a miracle of physics occurred. While inverted, the aerodynamic forces on the wings were reversed. Lift became a downward force, pushing the aircraft not towards the ground, but away from it. The P-40's terminal dive momentarily arrested. He was now flying upside down, but he was no longer plummeting. He was, for a precious few seconds, gaining altitude. But he couldn't stay inverted forever. His engine, already starved of oil, was now being starved of fuel. In an inverted position, gravity prevented fuel from the main tanks from reaching the carburetor. The Allison sputtered and threatened to quit entirely, so Adair improvised again. He continued the roll, completing a full 360-degree rotation. As the plane came upright again, fuel flowed back to the engine, which coughed back to life for a few more precious seconds. And as soon as he was upright, the dive began anew. He had discovered a pattern, a bizarre and desperate rhythm of survival. He would allow the plane to dive, then kick the rudder and roll it inverted to gain a little altitude. Then he would complete the roll, allowing the engine to catch its breath before the cycle began again. Roll, climb inverted, roll, dive upright. It was a staggering display of airmanship, a technique invented on the spot, born from the absolute refusal to die. He was essentially flying in a series of corkscrews, a wounded bird tumbling through the sky, but tumbling in a controlled direction. The Japanese pilots, who had circled to watch him crash, could only stare in disbelief at the grotesque aerial ballet. What they were witnessing defied their understanding of how an airplane was supposed to fly. They had shot him down, but he refused to fall. After a few moments of stunned observation, they broke off, perhaps concluding that this mad American pilot was determined to find his own unique way to crash. Once again, Philip Adair was alone in the sky. The departure of the Japanese fighters offered no relief, only a different kind of challenge. The silence in the sky was now replaced by the terrifying sounds coming from his own aircraft. The Allison engine was in its death throes, a symphony of grinding metal and violent shudders that shook the entire airframe. Each time he rolled upright, it would roar back to a semblance of life, only to sputter and choke as he went inverted. He was flying a 10,000-pound machine that was actively trying to tear itself apart, guiding it home through a series of controlled, acrobatic maneuvers that no pilot had ever trained for. His world was a nauseating cycle of blue sky and green jungle, A disorienting, gut-wrenching roller coaster ride. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. His arms ached from the sheer physical effort of manhandling the crippled fighter, fighting the rudder to initiate each life-saving roll. His new objective was Nagaguli, an auxiliary airfield. Din John was too far. He had to find a friendly runway, any runway, before the engine gave up completely. Navigating was a nightmare. He could only get a clear view of the ground in brief glimpses as he rolled through the upright position. It was like trying to read a map while strapped to a malfunctioning carnival ride. He flew by instinct and dead reckoning, using distant landmarks in the hazy landscape to guide his tumbling, wounded bird. Every completed roll was a small victory, buying him a few more seconds of flight, a few more yards of distance. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The P-40, a machine designed for elegant speed and power, was now a clumsy, lurching beast, its dance of death a testament to the sheer will of the man inside it. As he neared the vicinity of Nagaguli, the inevitable finally happened. With a final, catastrophic bang and a shudder that vibrated through Adair's very bones, the Allison V-1710 engine seized. The propeller, which had been clawing at the air, spun to a sudden, jarring halt. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise had been. He was now a glider pilot, but his glider was a battle-damaged fighter plane with no elevator controls and a dead engine. The friendly strip of Nagaguli was in sight, but it was agonizingly far away. In a conventional glide, he would never make it. The P-40's natural tendency to dive would put him into the jungle canopy a mile short of the runway. He had one last card to play, one final, desperate application of his newly discovered and bizarre flying technique. He kicked the rudder one last time. With no engine torque to help him, the maneuver was sluggish, agonizingly slow. The plane grudgingly began to roll. He was going to try and land it, or more accurately, crash land it. To extend his glide, he put the P-40 on its back one last time. Flying inverted, the crippled aircraft maintained its precious altitude for a few seconds longer, stretching his glide path just enough to clear the jungle at the edge of the airfield. As the runway threshold rushed up to meet him, he knew he couldn't land upside down. He had to get the gear down and the plane upright. While still inverted, he began pumping the emergency hand crank for the landing gear. It was a brutal, physically demanding task, trying to force the wheels down against gravity and hydraulic pressure. Then he completed his final roll, leveling out just feet above the ground. He had no way to flare for a soft landing. The P-40 hit the runway hard, a screeching, tearing impact of metal on Earth. It careened down the strip, shedding parts, one wing digging into the dirt, spinning the wreck in a cloud of dust and debris before it finally, violently, shuddered to a stop. The silence returned. The battle was over. Philip Adair was alive. Ground crews and medics raced towards the mangled wreckage of the P-40, expecting to find the worst. What they found instead was a testament to the Warhawk's legendary toughness and the pilot's sheer indomitability. The cockpit was largely intact, and inside, bruised, battered, and utterly exhausted, but miraculously alive, sat Second Lieutenant Philip Adair. He had been shot down, his aircraft rendered virtually uncontrollable, and he had flown it home by inventing a new and impossible method of flight on the fly. He had survived what by all rights should have been his final mission. But the true scale of his achievement that day was only just beginning to be understood. Back at Din John Airfield, the target of the massive Japanese raid, the all-clear sirens had sounded. The personnel emerged from their shelters, looking up at an empty sky, bewildered. They had been braced for a devastating attack, for the rain of bombs that would have crippled the Hump airlift. But the bombs never fell. Not a single one. Reports began to trickle in. An enormous enemy formation had been spotted, heading directly for them. Then, inexplicably, it had scattered and turned back, its mission a total failure. At first, no one could understand why. A force of 64 aircraft does not simply turn around for no reason. It was only when Adair's story was pieced together that the incredible truth became clear. The chaos, the disruption, the sheer terrifying audacity of his one-man charge had completely unraveled the enemy's plan. He hadn't shot down dozens of planes, but he had accomplished something far more strategically important. He had saved the base. The value of what Adair had protected cannot be overstated. The C-47 transports, the barrels of aviation fuel, the tons of ammunition, these were the irreplaceable assets that kept the war in China alive. The loss of Din John would have been a staggering blow, silencing the lifeline over the Himalayas for weeks, if not months. By himself, facing odds of 64-1, Philip Adair had averted a strategic disaster. His courage was formally recognized on January 8, 1944. Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, the formidable commander of all United States forces in the CBI theater, personally pinned the Silver Star to Adair's chest. It was a decoration for gallantry in action, a small piece of metal and ribbon that symbolized an act of almost unbelievable bravery and skill. The story of Philip Adair is more than just a tale of a lopsided dogfight. It is a profound lesson in the nature of asymmetrical warfare, where victory is not always defined by who has the bigger army, but by who can think and adapt under the most extreme pressure. It is a testament to the idea that a single individual, armed with courage and ingenuity, can alter the course of events even when faced with seemingly insurmountable odds. His flight that day, a desperate, tumbling journey in a shattered machine, was not just an act of survival. It was a masterclass in improvisation, a redefining of the relationship between a pilot and his plane. He didn't just fly the P-40. He willed it through the air, turning its dying gasps into a final, decisive act of defiance that echoed across the forgotten front of the China-Burma-India theater.